Welcome to Stories in Rain, your nightly haven for chilling tales and calming sounds. Tonight, we're delving into the mysteries of Friday the 13th, and we want you to join in. Have you experienced something strange, lucky, or downright spooky on this infamous day? Share your most memorable Friday the 13th story in the comments below. Whether it was a close call, unexpected fortune, or an inexplicable event, we want to hear it all. Give us the details. Where were you? What happened? How did it affect you? Your experience might just inspire our next story. This is your space to share, so don't hold back. Grab that warm drink, get cozy, and let's make the comment section as thrilling as the stories themselves. The calendar on my nightstand blinked 12 a.m., and Friday the 13th began. I never gave much thought to superstitions, but as I reached to silence my alarm, my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Confused, I turned on the lamp and found 13 tarnished pennies arranged in a perfect circle, all showing tails. I lived alone. There was no logical explanation for this, but I brushed it off as a strange prank, perhaps by a forgetful friend who'd visited earlier. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a day that would challenge everything I believed about luck, coincidence, and the thin veil between our world and something far more sinister. The morning progressed with an unsettling series of minor inconveniences. My coffee maker sputtered and died, leaving a puddle of grounds that vaguely resembled a screaming face. The hot water cut out mid-shower, and I could have sworn I heard laughter echoing through the pipes. On my way to work, every traffic light turned red as I approached, each lasting precisely 13 seconds before changing. At the office, things took a darker turn. My normally cheery cubicle mate, Sarah, greeted me with a vacant stare. "Happy Friday," she said, her voice oddly flat. "Did you know that in some countries, 13 is considered lucky?" Her left eye twitched as she spoke, and I noticed a small, black cat-shaped birthmark behind her ear that I'd never seen before. Throughout the day, I caught glimpses of the number 13 everywhere. In random strings of code on my computer, in the number of people waiting for the elevator, even in the sudden proliferation of black cats that seemed to be roaming the office corridors. Each sighting sent a chill down my spine, but I clung to my skepticism like a lifeline. As evening approached, a dense fog rolled in, obscuring the city. My phone buzzed with a weather alert, unprecedented meteorological event. All residents advised to remain indoors until further notice. The message was timestamped 1313. Heeding the warning, I decided to wait out the fog in my office. As darkness fell, the power flickered and died, plunging the building into an eerie silence. In the dim emergency lighting, shadows seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. A soft sound caught my attention, the gentle swoosh of the elevator arriving at our floor. But that was impossible. The power was out. Heart pounding, I crept towards the elevator bank. The doors slid open with a cheerful ding, revealing a pitch-black interior. And then, from within that darkness, 13 pairs of glowing eyes blinked into existence. I scrambled backwards, my skepticism evaporating like mist. From the elevator, a voice that was not quite human called out, "Join us. Every Friday the 13th, we choose one. This time, it's you." Panic propelled me towards the stairwell. I burst through the door and began my descent, taking the steps 2 at a time. But something was wrong. No matter how many flights I ran down, I never seemed to reach the bottom. The numbers on each floor sign blurred as I passed. 13, 13, 13, over and over again. Exhausted and terrified, I finally stopped. The door in front of me was different, ornate and ancient-looking, with intricate carvings of black cats and broken mirrors. With trembling fingers, I turned the handle. I found myself back in my own bedroom, the digital clock once again blinking 12 a.m. For a moment, relief washed over me. Had it all been a nightmare? But then I saw them, 13 tarnished pennies arranged in a perfect circle on my nightstand, all showing heads this time. And as I watched, frozen in horror, they began to spin. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was a chorus of whispers, "See you next Friday the 13th. I awoke with a start, my heart racing. The room was filled with early morning light, and my clock read 7 a.m. Friday the 13th had just begun, and I had the strangest feeling that I'd lived this day before. As I reached for my phone, my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. The 13th mile. Jack Thornton gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up '97 Chevy, his knuckles white as he peered through the windshield at the rain-slicked highway. It was 11:45 p.m. on Thursday, August 12th, and he was determined to make it to his sister's wedding in time. The fact that he'd be driving through the witching hour into Friday the 13th didn't bother him much. "It's just another day," he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the way his GPS kept glitching, the estimated arrival time flickering between 13 to 13 and 66:66. As the clock on his dashboard ticked over to midnight, Jack felt a subtle shift in the air. The rain intensified, pounding against the roof of the car like angry fists. Lightning flashed, illuminating a sign by the roadside. Route 13, next exit. Jack frowned. That wasn't right. He was supposed to be on Interstate 95, heading north. But as he checked his GPS again, it showed him firmly on Route 13, a road that didn't exist on any map he knew. Recalculating, the GPS chirped, its robotic voice taking on an almost gleeful tone. Take the next exit to continue on Route 13. Against his better judgment, Jack followed the GPS's instructions. As he took the exit, he felt a strange sensation, as if the car had driven through a curtain of static electricity. The rain stopped abruptly, and Jack found himself on a long, straight road that stretched into darkness. The full moon hung low and large in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Jack noticed with growing unease that every mile marker he passed read 13, no matter how far he drove. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, Jack saw headlights in his rearview mirror. Relief washed over him at the sight of another vehicle, but it was short-lived. The car behind him was an exact replica of his own, right down to the dent in the front fender. Jack's heart raced as the doppelganger car pulled alongside him. He turned to look, dreading what he might see. The driver was a mirror image of himself, but with hollow, black eyes and a grotesque grin that split its face unnaturally wide. Panicked, Jack floored the accelerator, but his car wouldn't go faster than 13 miles per hour. The other car kept pace effortlessly, its driver never taking its eyes off Jack. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, cycling through stations. 13 fatalities in a multi-car pileup. 13th disappearance this year on this stretch of road. Locals call it the Highway to Hell, claiming it only appears on Friday the 13th. Jack tried to turn it off, but the volume only increased. Through the cacophony, he heard a voice that sounded disturbingly like his own. "Every road trip needs a destination, Jack. Where do you think this one ends?" As if in answer, a sign appeared ahead. Last exit, 13 miles. But no matter how long he drove, the sign remained 13 miles away, always just out of reach. More cars appeared, each a variation of Jack's vehicle, driven by twisted versions of himself. They formed a convoy, boxing him in. Jack realized with horror that each driver represented a different fate. One was badly burned, another looked like a corpse that had been underwater for weeks, a third was riddled with bullet holes. The GPS spoke again. "In 13 miles, you will reach your final destination. We hope you've enjoyed traveling with us on Route 13. Jack's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by too many energy drinks and too little sleep. He closed his eyes tightly, counting to 13, praying that when he opened them, he'd be back on the normal highway. 12, 13! Jack opened his eyes. The nightmare convoy was gone. He was alone on a normal-looking road, the gentle patter of rain against his windshield the only sound. He let out a shaky laugh of relief. Then he saw the sign ahead, "Welcome to Thornton Springs." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Thornton Springs was his hometown, the place he'd left 13 years ago, vowing never to return. The place where, on a Friday the 13th, much like this one, he'd been involved in a hit-and-run accident that left a young girl in a coma. As he drove into town, Jack noticed that every clock he passed was stuck at 1:13. The streets were deserted, save for a solitary figure standing in the road ahead. As he got closer, Jack's blood ran cold. It was the girl he'd hit all those years ago, still 13 years old, staring at him with knowing eyes. She pointed to a house on the right, his childhood home. In the driveway sat his old car, the one he'd been driving that fateful night, its front end crumpled. The girl spoke, her voice echoing inside Jack's head. You can't outrun fate, Jack, especially not on Friday the 13th. Some journeys are circular, always bringing you back to where you began. Welcome home. Jack's car rolled to a stop in front of the house, the engine dying despite his efforts to keep it running. As he sat there, paralyzed with fear and guilt, he saw 13 versions of himself emerge from the house. Each one represented a year of his life since the accident, showing the toll his secret had taken on him. The girl approached his car, smiling sadly. It's time to face your luck, Jack. Good or bad, it's all been leading to this moment. As the first light of dawn broke on Friday the 13th, Jack Thornton stepped out of his car, ready to confront the past he'd tried so hard to escape. He realized now that every mile he'd driven since that night had been leading him back here, to this moment of reckoning. The 13th hour had begun, and with it, a journey of a different kind. One that would determine not just Jack's fate, but the very nature of luck and consequences, in a world where every Friday the 13th brings a chance for redemption or damnation. And somewhere in the distance, on a highway that doesn't exist on any mortal map, a convoy of fate-touched cars continues its endless journey, waiting for the next traveler to join their ranks on Route 13. The incessant beeping of my alarm dragged me from a fitful sleep. As I fumbled to silence it, my eyes fell on the date displayed on my phone, Friday, September 13th. A small shiver ran down my spine, but I quickly shook it off. I, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, respected psychologist specializing in superstition and irrational fears, didn't believe in such nonsense. Today was just another day, albeit one where I'd be presenting my groundbreaking research on the psychology of Friday the 13th at the International Symposium on Superstition and Mental Health. As I went through my morning routine, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed off somehow, as if it were a fraction of a second behind my movements. I blinked hard, attributing the disconcerting effect to my late night preparing for the symposium. On my drive to the conference center, I found myself stuck behind a black cat that darted across the road, causing a minor traffic jam. 13 cars, I muttered, counting the vehicles ahead of me. I caught myself and chuckled at the absurdity. I was letting the day get to me, seeing patterns where none existed. The symposium was being held at the historic Triskaideka Hotel, a grand old building with intricate Victorian architecture. As I walked through the ornate lobby, my heels clicking on the marble floor, I noticed the unusual chandelier, 13 crystal tiers, each holding 13 candle-shaped bulbs. A plaque nearby boasted that the hotel had embraced its connection to the number 13, with 13 floors and 13 rooms on each. Dr. Marsh? A voice startled me from my observations. I turned to see a young man in a hotel uniform, his name tag reading, Jack. We're so honored to have you here. I'm to escort you to the Superstition Suite where you'll be staying. As we rode the elevator, Jack chatted enthusiastically about the hotel's history. It's said that on every Friday the 13th, strange things happen here. Guests report seeing their reflections move independently, hearing whispers from empty rooms. But it's all just stories, right, Doctor? I smiled tightly, uncomfortable with his intensity. Of course, mass hysteria and suggestion can create powerful illusions. The elevator dinged, and we stepped out onto the 13th floor. The corridor stretched before us, seemingly longer than physically possible, given the hotel's exterior dimensions. At the far end, a large mirror reflected our approach. Here we are, Suite 1313, Jack announced, opening the door with a flourish. The seminar begins at 1:13 p.m. in the Blackwood Ballroom. Don't be late. He winked and disappeared down the corridor before I could respond. I entered the suite, immediately struck by its lavish decor, all in shades of black and silver. Mirrors adorned every wall, creating a disorienting effect. I set down my briefcase and began to unpack, trying to focus on my upcoming presentation. As I rehearsed my talking points, a movement in one of the mirrors caught my eye. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw myself standing still, watching me with a cold, calculating gaze. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Stress, I muttered. It's just stress. Time seemed to move strangely as I prepared for the seminar. My watch showed 12:45 p.m., then suddenly it was 1:10 p.m. with no memory of the intervening minutes. Cursing under my breath, I grabbed my materials and hurried to the elevator. The Blackwood ballroom was packed with colleagues and journalists, all eager to hear about my research. As I took the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. I began my presentation confidently, discussing the historical and cultural roots of Friday the 13th superstitions. But as I spoke, I became increasingly aware of subtle oddities in the room. The shadows seemed too deep, moving slightly even when nothing stirred. Audience members, faces blurred when I tried to focus on them, except for their eyes, which seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. Halfway through my speech, I faltered. The words on my note cards began to shift and change, rearranging themselves into ominous messages. They're watching you. You can't escape. 13 is coming. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. As I was saying, I continued, my voice shaking slightly, our fears about Friday the 13th are largely unfounded, based on. I trailed off as I realized the entire audience was mouthing my words in perfect synchronization, their eyes now completely black. Panic rising in my throat, I stumbled off the stage and out of the ballroom. The hotel corridors seemed to twist and stretch as I ran, every turn bringing me back to the same spot. Mirrors lined the walls, and in each one, I saw myself standing still, watching with that same cold, calculating gaze I'd noticed earlier. I finally found my way back to Suite 1313, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of psychotic break, a manifestation of stress and overwork. As I paced the room, my reflection caught my eye once again. But this time it didn't move with me. It stood perfectly still, a cruel smile playing on its lips. Then it spoke, its voice a chilling echo of my own. Poor, rational Dr. Marsh. You've spent your whole career trying to disprove the power of Friday the 13th. But did you ever stop to consider that your disbelief might be exactly what makes you the perfect vessel? I watched in horror as my reflection stepped out of the mirror, becoming solid and three-dimensional. I, circled me slowly, predatorily. Every Friday the 13th, we choose one. Someone who thinks they're above it all, who's certain they can't be touched by the power of this day. And this time, Evelyn, it's you. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place as my doppelganger approached, its hand reaching for my face. As its cold fingers touched my skin, I felt a rush of memories, hundreds of Friday the 13ths, hundreds of victims, all experienced from the other side of the mirror. Don't worry, my reflection whispered, its form beginning to merge with mine. You'll get used to it, and in time, you might even enjoy choosing the next one. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I was powerless as I felt myself being pulled into the mirror. The last thing I saw was my own face, now wearing that cold, calculating expression, watching as I disappeared into the reflective surface. In the empty room, a phone buzzed on the bedside table. A text message appeared on the screen. Dr. Marsh, your next appointment is on Friday, December 13th. The patient's name is... The screen went dark, reflecting the empty suite. And in that reflection, just for a moment, a figure could be seen smiling. A smile that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. In the days that followed, colleagues would remark on how Dr. Evelyn Marsh seemed changed after her groundbreaking presentation. Her research took a new direction, exploring the potential reality behind superstitions. And if anyone noticed the new glint in her eye when she discussed Friday the 13th, they chalked it up to academic passion. After all, there's no reason to fear a simple date, is there? The 13th hour, Dr. Samantha Cole checked her watch as she hurried down the sterile hospital corridor. 11:58 p.m. Thursday, August 12th. In 2 minutes, it would be Friday the 13th, and her 12-hour shift in the psychiatric ward would begin. As head psychiatrist, she'd volunteered for this shift, determined to prove to her colleagues and patients that there was nothing to fear from an arbitrary date. The ward was unusually quiet as she entered, the air thick with anticipation. Nurse Jenkins greeted her with a tight smile. "Doctor, you might want to reconsider your shift. We've had incidents on previous Friday the 13th. Samantha sighed, having heard these warnings before. "Jake, we've discussed this. It's mass hysteria, nothing more. In fact, I'm planning to use tonight as a case study in my research on collective delusions." Jake shook his head. "Just be careful, Doc. Something about this place changes when the clock strikes midnight on the 13th. As if on cue, the large clock in the common area began to chime. Samantha counted the strikes, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 12. And then unexpectedly a 13th chime echoed through the ward, impossibly loud and resonant. In that moment, every light in the ward flickered and dimmed, casting long, writhing shadows on the walls. Samantha blinked, disoriented. When her vision cleared, she gasped. The normally white walls now seemed to pulse with a faint, reddish hue, as if the building itself had come alive. "What in the world?" she muttered, reaching for her phone to document this strange occurrence. But her phone was dead, the screen displaying only the time, 13:13. A scream pierced the air, snapping Samantha back to her professional duties. She raced towards the source, finding a patient named Emily huddled in the corner of her room, rocking back and forth. "Emily? What's wrong?" Samantha asked, approaching cautiously. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wild with fear. "It's here, the 13th hour. They told me you wouldn't believe, but you have to. It feeds on our fear, grows stronger with each Friday the 13th, and now it's hungry again." Samantha tried to maintain her composure. "Emily, remember what we've discussed about your delusions. There is no 13th hour, and nothing supernatural is happening. Let's focus on grounding techniques." But Emily wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on something behind Samantha. "It's chosen you this time, Doctor. I'm so sorry." A chill ran down Samantha's spine. Slowly, she turned around, half expecting to see nothing. Instead, she found herself face to face with herself. But this doppelganger was wrong somehow, its smile too wide, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. Samantha stumbled backwards. "This isn't real. It's a hallucination, a shared delusion," she muttered, trying to convince herself. Her double spoke, its voice a twisted echo of her own. "Oh, but it is real, Doctor. Your disbelief, your rational mind, they've made you the perfect conduit. Tonight, you'll help us bring the 13th hour into your world permanently." Samantha ran from the room, her heart pounding. The corridors of the ward seemed to stretch and distort, defying the laws of physics. Every door she passed displayed the number 13, no matter what the room number should have been. She found Jake at the nurse's station, his face pale with fear. "Doc, thank God you're okay. The patients, they're all..." Samantha followed his gaze to the security monitors. Every screen showed patients sitting calmly on their beds, staring directly at the cameras. And behind each patient stood a shadow, vaguely humanoid but wrong in ways she couldn't quite define. "This is impossible," Samantha whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Jake gripped her arm. "Doc, listen to me. Every Friday the 13th, this place becomes a focal point for something. Something that feeds on fear and belief. The more people believe in it, the stronger it gets. And now, with social media and instant communication, belief spreads faster than ever." Samantha wanted to argue, to find a rational explanation, but the evidence of her own eyes was becoming harder to deny. "What do we do?" Jake's expression was grim. "We have to make it through the 13th hour. From midnight to 1:13 a.m., the barrier between our world and whatever that thing is, it's at its thinnest. If we can resist, if we can hold on to our disbelief, we might be able to weaken it." As if in response to his words, a low, thrumming sound began to fill the air. The reddish pulse in the walls intensified, and Samantha could have sworn she saw faces forming in the shifting patterns, mouths open in silent screams. Over the next hour, Samantha and Jake fought to maintain their grasp on reality. They witnessed impossible things. Patients walking through walls, gravity reversing in isolated pockets, reflections coming to life and stepping out of mirrors. Each time, Samantha forced herself to find alternative explanations, to cling to her disbelief even as the evidence mounted. As the 13th hour neared its end, the very fabric of reality seemed to be tearing. Rifts appeared in the air, offering glimpses of a realm of perpetual twilight and twisted geometry. Samantha's doppelganger appeared again, its form now barely holding a human shape. "Give in, Doctor," it hissed. "Your belief will open the door permanently. Embrace the fear, let it consume you, and take your place as the herald of the 13th hour." Samantha stood her ground, drawing on every ounce of her rational mind. "No," she said firmly, "I don't believe in you. You're a manifestation of our collective fears, nothing more. And I refuse to give you power." She turned to the patients, her voice ringing with authority. "All of you, listen to me. This isn't real. It's a shared hallucination, fueled by our expectations and fears. But we can end it. Focus on what you know is real, on the solid facts of our world. Reject the impossible." For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the rifts began to close. The reddish pulse faded from the walls, and the shadows retreated. The doppelganger screamed in fury as it was drawn back into a mirror, its form dissolving. At precisely 1:13 a.m., the ward fell silent. The lights returned to normal, and Samantha's phone came back to life, now showing the correct time. Jake let out a shaky breath. "Is it over?" Samantha nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "For now. But as long as people believe, as long as Friday the 13th holds power in our collective psyche, it will never truly be over." In the days that followed, Samantha struggled to reconcile what she'd experienced with her scientific worldview. She knew that publishing her findings would likely end her career, yet she couldn't simply ignore what had happened. In the end, she chose a middle path. Her official report cited mass hysteria and shared delusions, a rational explanation for an irrational night. But she also began a private study, delving into the power of collective belief and its potential to shape reality. And as the next Friday the 13th approached, Samantha found herself watching the clock, wondering if belief alone could be enough to hold back the 13th hour, or if their victory had been just another part of a larger, unfathomable plan. In her dreams, she still heard that 13th chime, a reminder that some truths lie beyond the realm of science, waiting in the shadows of human belief. The misfortune spiral. Ethan Green had always considered himself a rational man. As a statistician, he knew that so-called bad luck was nothing more than random chance, devoid of any mystical significance. So when he woke up on Friday the 13th to find his alarm hadn't gone off, he didn't think much of it. Electronic devices fail sometimes. It was a minor inconvenience, nothing more. But as he rushed to get ready for an important presentation at work, the incidents began to pile up. He burned his tongue on his coffee. His favorite tie had an inexplicable stain. The hot water cut out halfway through his shower. Each mishap was small, easily explained away, yet a creeping unease began to settle in the pit of Ethan's stomach. On his drive to the office, the pattern continued. Every traffic light turned red just as he approached. A black cat darted across the road, causing him to swerve. He could have sworn the cat's eyes glowed an unnatural shade of green as it watched him from the sidewalk. When he finally arrived at work, the only available parking spot was number 13. Ethan shook his head, trying to dispel the superstitious thoughts creeping into his mind. "It's confirmation bias," he muttered to himself as he hurried into the building. "I'm only noticing these things because of the date." The elevator was crowded, and Ethan found himself wedged into the back corner. As the doors began to close, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirrored wall. For a split second, he could have sworn his reflection winked at him, a mischievous smirk playing on its lips. Ethan blinked hard, but when he looked again, his reflection was normal, mimicking his confused expression. The presentation was a disaster from the start. His laptop refused to connect to the projector. When he finally got it working, he realized with horror that his carefully prepared slides had been replaced with images of broken mirrors, upside-down horseshoes, and the number 13 repeated endlessly. His colleagues stared at him in bewildered silence as he fumbled to explain, feeling the weight of their judgment with each passing second. By lunchtime, Ethan was a nervous wreck. He sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at a salad that somehow contained an inordinate number of bruised leaves and overripe tomatoes. As he ate, he overheard snippets of conversation from nearby tables. "Did you hear about the accident on 13th Street? My cousin's flight got canceled. It was meant to leave from gate 13. 13 people called in sick today. Weird, right? Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass, causing him to knock it over. The water spilled across the table, forming a puddle that, just for a moment, seemed to reflect a sky filled with ominous storm clouds rather than the fluorescent lights of the cafeteria ceiling. As the day wore on, Ethan's rational mind waged a losing battle against the mounting evidence of something beyond mere coincidence. His computer crashed, losing hours of work. He received 13 consecutive spam calls, each from a number ending in 13. A potted plant fell from a high shelf, missing his head by inches. By the time he left work, Ethan was jumping at shadows. The setting sun cast an eerie red glow over the city, and he could have sworn the clouds were forming shapes. Broken ladders, upended salt shakers, and leering black cats. His drive home was a gauntlet of near misses and inexplicable occurrences. Twice, other drivers swerved into his lane, their faces obscured by strange shadows. His GPS kept rerouting him down unfamiliar streets, each one numbered 13 or named after some harbinger of ill fortune. When Ethan finally reached his apartment building, he breathed a sigh of relief. Safety was just an elevator ride away. But as he stepped into the lift and pressed the button for his floor, he realized with dawning horror that the number pad had changed. Every button now displayed 13. The elevator began to move, but instead of going up, it plummeted down. Ethan's stomach lurched as the floor numbers on the display ticked by at impossible speed, 1, 0, -1, -2, all the way down to -13. The doors opened with a cheerful ding, revealing a long, dark corridor that couldn't possibly exist beneath the building. Ethan stumbled out, his legs shaky. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with doors bearing the number 13. From behind each door came sounds, breaking glass, yowling cats, the snap of a mirror cracking. At the end of the hall stood a full-length mirror. As Ethan approached, his reflection came into view, but it wasn't mimicking his movements. It stood perfectly still, a wide grin splitting its face. "Welcome, Ethan," his reflection spoke, its voice a distorted version of his own. "We've been waiting for you." What is this place?" Ethan stammered, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The reflection's grin widened impossibly. "This is where probability bends, where the unlikely becomes certain. You've spent your life dismissing us, luck, fate, superstition, but we're very real, Ethan, and now you're going to help us spread." "Spread?" Ethan echoed, a chill running down his spine. "Bad luck is contagious, Ethan. Each little misfortune you experience today, it rippled out, affecting others. And now, you're the epicenter of a bad luck epidemic. Every Friday the 13th it grows stronger. But we needed someone like you. Someone who could reach a tipping point of improbability without breaking. Someone whose mind could withstand the paradox long enough to become a conduit." The reflection reached out, its hand passing through the mirror's surface like water. "Don't fight it, Ethan. Embrace the chaos. Become the vessel for misfortune, and watch as the world unravels, one unlikely disaster at a time." Ethan wanted to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but he found himself rooted to the spot. As the reflection's hand touched his chest, he felt a surge of energy, the accumulated potential of every unlucky coincidence, every near miss, every twist of fate. In that moment, Ethan understood. He saw the web of causality, the delicate balance of probability that governed the universe, and he saw how, with the slightest push, that balance could be tipped into chaos. A part of him wanted to resist, to cling to his old beliefs in rationality and statistical normality. But a growing voice in his mind whispered of the power he now held, the ability to shape reality through sheer improbability. As Friday the 13th ticked over to Saturday the 14th, Ethan Green stepped back into the world, forever changed. To most, he would appear the same. But those who looked closely might notice the glint in his eye, the spring in his step that suggested he knew something they didn't. And in his wake, the laws of probability began to warp. Unlikely coincidences multiplied. Freak accidents became commonplace. The boundary between rational explanation and supernatural occurrence blurred. Ethan smiled to himself as he walked down the street, a black cat at his heels and a trail of upturned salt shakers in his wake. Friday the 13th was no longer just a day to him. It was the start of a new era, where luck itself danced to his tune. In boardrooms and laboratories around the world, experts would soon gather to discuss the inexplicable spike in improbable events. They would argue causation and correlation, propose theories and counter-theories, but none would suspect the truth, that bad luck had found its champion, and the age of misfortune had only just begun. The Luck Exchange. Melanie Zhao had never considered herself superstitious, but as she stared at the blinking cursor on her computer screen, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. It was 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, August 12th, and in 1 minute, it would be Friday the 13th. Normally, this wouldn't bother her, but tonight was different. Tonight, she was about to participate in something that defied all logical explanation. The email had arrived exactly 13 days ago, from an address that disappeared as soon as she'd read it. The subject line was simple: avoid bad luck, join the exchange. Initially, she dismissed it as spam, but as she read on, a chill had run through her body. The email knew things, private things about her life, her fears, the string of misfortunes that had plagued her over the past year. It offered a solution, a chance to participate in a mysterious online event called the Luck Exchange. Now, as the clock ticked over to midnight, Melanie took a deep breath and clicked the link that had appeared on her screen. Her monitor flickered, and suddenly she was looking at what appeared to be a live video feed of a dimly lit room. 13 other windows popped up around the edges, each showing a different person, their faces obscured by shadow. A voice, distorted and genderless, filled her headphones. Welcome to the Luck Exchange. You are here because luck has abandoned you, and you seek to change your fate. But remember, in this universe, luck is a finite resource. For one to gain, another must lose. Melanie's heart raced as the voice explained the rules. Each participant had been assigned a luck score based on their recent life events. Over the next hour, they would have the opportunity to trade their misfortunes, bidding to take on someone else's bad luck in exchange for their good fortune. But beware, the voice warned, for the luck you take may come with unforeseen consequences, and those who leave with the lowest luck scores, well, let's just say Friday the 13th will be particularly unkind to them. The bidding began, and Melanie watched in fascinated horror as people traded car accidents for job losses, illness for divorce. Each trade was accompanied by a brief flash of the consequences: a hospitalized loved one suddenly recovering, a lost wedding ring appearing in a drawer. Melanie hesitated, her cursor hovering over the bid button. This was madness, surely. Luck couldn't be quantified, couldn't be traded like this. But as she watched a young man sob with joy as his terminal cancer diagnosis was exchanged for someone else's 5 years of minor inconveniences, her resolve weakened. With trembling fingers, she placed her first bid, offering to take on someone's fear of heights in exchange for alleviating her recent financial troubles. The moment she clicked confirm, she felt a wave of vertigo wash over her. Images flashed through her mind, standing on the edge of a skyscraper, looking down at the dizzying drop below. But when she checked her phone, she saw a notification from her bank. A large deposit had just cleared, enough to cover her debts and then some. As the night wore on, Melanie found herself drawn deeper into the exchange. She traded her chronic insomnia for someone's bad luck in love, her fear of public speaking for another streak of gambling losses. With each trade, she felt herself changing, accumulating the weight of others' misfortunes while her own burdens lifted. But there was a price. With each bid, the shadowy figures in the other windows became more distinct, their features twisting into expressions of pain or ecstasy as luck was lost and gained. Melanie caught glimpses of her own reflection in her webcam feed, noticing how her eyes seemed to grow darker, her smile a little more strained. As the final minutes of the exchange ticked down, Melanie found herself in fierce competition for a particularly valuable piece of luck, a guaranteed successful business venture. The bidding was intense, with participants offering years of minor ailments, strings of failed relationships, even decades of narrowly avoided disasters. In a moment of desperation, Melanie made a final bid. She offered up her luckiest day, a future date where everything would have gone perfectly, a day of pure joy and success that she would now never experience. The moment she confirmed the bid, she felt a profound sense of loss. as if a light inside her had been extinguished. But she had won. As the clock struck 1:13 a.m., the voice returned, congratulating her on her new fortune. The screens went dark, leaving Melanie alone in the soft glow of her monitor. At first, everything seemed wonderful. In the weeks that followed, Melanie's life transformed. Her career took off, her relationships flourished, and opportunities seemed to fall into her lap. But there was a hollowness to her success, a nagging feeling that something was missing. And then the consequences of her trades began to manifest. She found herself paralyzed with fear at the slightest height, unable to even climb a stepladder. Insomnia was replaced by vivid nightmares that left her gasping for breath. Every time she felt joy, she couldn't shake the knowledge that her happiest day had been traded away, leaving a void that could never be filled. Worse still were the glimpses she caught of the other participants. She'd see them on the street or in crowds, their faces etched with the pain of the misfortunes they'd taken on. Some seemed to be aging rapidly, while others moved like sleepwalkers, empty-eyed and lost. As months passed, Melanie's luck began to take on a twisted quality. She'd win the lottery, only to find the money was counterfeit. She'd meet the perfect partner, only to discover they were hiding dark secrets. It was as if the universe was balancing the scales, extracting payment for every stroke of good fortune. The next Friday the 13th approached, and Melanie received another email. "Ready for another round?" it asked. "Your luck balance is running low. Time to top up?" Melanie stared at the screen, her cursor hovering over the link. She knew she should delete it, turn off her computer, and walk away. But the thought of returning to her old life, of losing all she'd gained, was unbearable. And maybe this time, she could be smarter about her trades. Avoid the pitfalls she'd encountered before. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Melanie felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She realized now that luck wasn't just a random force. It was alive, hungry, always seeking balance. And in her attempts to game the system, she had become its unwitting servant. The screen flickered, showing the now familiar dimly lit room. Melanie saw her own face reflected in the monitor, barely recognizing the person she'd become. As 12 other windows popped up around the edges, she noticed an empty 13th space, waiting to be filled. Her finger hovered over the mouse. The choice was hers, to continue down this dark path of fortune and misfortune, or to face whatever fate had in store for her without interference. Either way, she knew that luck would have its due. For in this zero-sum game of fortune, every winner left a trail of losers in their wake, and the house always came to collect. As Friday the 13th began, Melanie made her choice, sealing her fate and setting in motion a chain of events that would ripple out into the world, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. For in the Great Luck Exchange, every decision had its price, and the true cost of fortune was only beginning to reveal itself. The Long Way Home Part 1, The Departure. Cassie Matthews stared at her phone, rereading the text message that had upended her life. "Mom's in the hospital. It's bad. Come home, Dad." She hadn't spoken to her parents in 5 years, not since that disastrous Friday the 13th when she'd left town, vowing never to return. Now, as the clock ticked toward midnight on yet another Thursday, August 12th, Cassie found herself packing a bag, preparing for a journey she never wanted to make. Her roommate Tyler leaned against the doorframe. "You sure about this, Cass? I mean, it's going to be Friday the 13th. You know how you get about that day." Cassie zipped up her duffel bag with more force than necessary. "I don't have a choice. Mom's sick, and I need to make things right." Tyler nodded, then tossed her a small object. Cassie caught it reflexively, a rabbit's foot keychain. "For luck," Tyler said with a wry smile. "God knows you'll need it." As Cassie climbed into her old Ford Fiesta, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in her stomach. The 300-mile drive to her hometown of Millbrook would take her through the night and into the early hours of Friday the 13th. She took a deep breath, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled out onto the empty street. Part 2, The Midnight Hour. The first hour of the drive was uneventful. Cassie kept the radio off, lost in memories of the last time she'd made this trip. In reverse, fleeing Millbrook and the tragedy that had shattered her world. As the digital clock on her dashboard clicked over to 12 a.m., officially marking the start of Friday the 13th, a shiver ran down her spine. Almost immediately, a thick fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of her car. Cassie slowed down, squinting to make out the road ahead. That's when she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the highway, motionless. Cassie slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. As the car skidded to a stop, she realized the figure was a young girl, no more than 13 years old, wearing a tattered white dress. The girl's eyes met Cassie's through the windshield, and in that moment, Cassie felt a jolt of recognition. It couldn't be. Could it? Before she could process what she was seeing, the girl vanished, leaving Cassie alone in the fog. Shaken, she took a few deep breaths, trying to convince herself it had been a trick of the light, a hallucination born of stress and lack of sleep. But as she started driving again, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The fog seemed to move with purposeful tendrils, guiding her down exits she hadn't intended to take, leading her deeper into unfamiliar territory. Part 3, the 13th hour. As 1 a.m. approached, Cassie found herself on a narrow, winding road that didn't appear on any map. Her GPS had gone haywire, alternating between signal lost and directing her to continue on Route 13 for eternity. The trees on either side of the road seemed to lean in, their branches reaching for her car like gnarled fingers. Suddenly, her radio crackled to life of its own accord. Through bursts of static, Cassie heard fragments of news reports. 13-car pileup on Highway 13. 13th disappearance this year. Locals call it the Nightmare Road, claiming it only appears on Friday the 13th. Between the news snippets, Cassie caught glimpses of a hauntingly familiar melody, the lullaby her mother used to sing to her as a child. But the tune was distorted, played in a minor key that sent chills down her spine. As the clock struck 1:13 a.m., Cassie saw a sign looming out of the darkness. Welcome to Millbrook, where every day is Friday the 13th. But this wasn't the Millbrook she remembered. The town looked abandoned, decrepit, as if it had aged decades in the 5 years she'd been gone. Part 4, the reunion. Cassie pulled up to the hospital, a foreboding structure that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As she walked through the sliding doors, she felt as if she were stepping into another world. The reception area was deserted, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of distant machines. "Hello?" Cassie called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. "I'm here to see Elizabeth Matthews." A nurse appeared as if from nowhere, her face obscured by shadows. "Ah yes, we've been expecting you, Cassandra. Your mother is in room 13, but before you go in, there's something you should know." Cassie's heart raced. "What is it? Is she okay?" The nurse's voice took on an otherworldly quality. "Time works differently here, especially on Friday the 13th. The moment you step into that room, you'll be faced with a choice, one that will determine not just your fate, but the fate of everyone in Millbrook." Before Cassie could respond, the nurse vanished. Fighting back panic, Cassie made her way to room 13. As she reached for the door handle, she hesitated, remembering the events that had driven her away 5 years ago. The accident, the coma, the whispers of a curse that had plagued her family for generations. Taking a deep breath, Cassie opened the door. Part 5, the reckoning. The room was bathed in an eerie, pulsing light. In the hospital bed lay not just her mother, but 3 versions of her. One as Cassie remembered her from childhood, one as she'd been the day Cassie left, and one withered and aged beyond her years. "Hello, sweetheart," they spoke in unison. "We've been waiting for you." Cassie stumbled back, her mind reeling. What is this?" The oldest version of her mother smiled sadly. "This is the moment of truth, Cassie. The curse that's followed our family for generations comes to a head every Friday the 13th. But this time, you have the power to break it." The room began to shift and warp, showing Cassie visions of the past, present, and possible futures. She saw the accident from 5 years ago, the young girl she'd hit with her car while fleeing an argument with her parents. She saw the girl in the coma, and the way her own guilt and fear had eaten away at her. But she also saw something else, a pattern of tragedies stretching back through her family line, all centered around Friday the 13th. And at the heart of it all, a deal made by a distant ancestor with a dark entity, trading good fortune for the family in exchange for a toll to be paid every Friday the 13th. The curse can be broken, her mothers explained, but it requires sacrifice. You must face your greatest fear, confront the guilt you've carried all these years. Only then can the cycle be broken. As they spoke, the room filled with mist, and Cassie found herself back on that fateful road from 5 years ago. The girl she'd hit stood before her, no longer accusing, but offering understanding. "It's time to forgive yourself," the girl said. "Only then can you forgive others and break the chain of misfortune that's bound your family for so long." Part 6. The Choice. Cassie stood at the crossroads of fate, understanding now that every decision she'd made, every mile she'd driven on this nightmarish journey, had been leading her to this moment. She could feel the weight of generations past and futures yet to come resting on her shoulders. With tears in her eyes, Cassie stepped forward and embraced the girl, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her remorse, but also opening her heart to the possibility of redemption. As they hugged, the world around them began to shift and change. The oppressive darkness that had hung over Millbrook started to lift. Cassie felt a surge of energy coursing through her, generations of pent-up luck and misfortune balancing out in one cathartic moment. When Cassie opened her eyes, she found herself back in the hospital room. But now, only one version of her mother remained, the real one, smiling weakly but with eyes full of love and forgiveness. "You did it, sweetheart," her mother whispered. "You broke the curse." Part 7. The New Day. As dawn broke on Friday the 13th, Cassie stood by the hospital window, watching as Millbrook slowly came back to life. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of renewal and hope. Her father joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't quite understand what happened last night," he said, "but I feel like a weight has been lifted, not just from us, but from the whole town." Cassie nodded, knowing that the full truth of what had transpired would be hard to explain. But she also knew that the nightmare was over. The curse that had plagued her family for generations had been broken. As she watched the sun rise on a new day, Cassie realized that her long journey home had been about more than just physical distance. It had been a journey through time, through the tangled web of family history and personal guilt. And in facing her fears, in confronting the darkness that had haunted her, she had found her way back to herself. The rabbit's foot keychain Tyler had given her fell from her pocket, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Cassie smiled, realizing she didn't need it anymore. She had faced her worst Friday the 13th and come out the other side. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it. No luck required. As Cassie left the hospital with her parents, ready to reconnect and rebuild, she cast one last glance at the road that had brought her here. For a moment, she thought she saw a shimmer in the air, like a door closing on the supernatural highway she'd traveled. The 13th hour had passed, and with it, the power it had held over her family. Cassie took a deep breath of the fresh morning air, feeling truly free for the first time in years. Friday the 13th would come again, as it always did. But now it would be just another day, a day full of possibilities, unburdened by the weight of cursed luck and generational misfortune. As she climbed into her car for the drive back to her apartment, Cassie couldn't help but smile. The long way home had been fraught with danger and fear, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. And now, with the curse broken and the future wide open, she was ready for whatever journey came next.